Welcome to our June Global Encounters seminar, and it's my absolute pleasure tonight to be welcoming Dr. Sophie Couchman. We've been chatting with Sophie for quite a while now, and we're particularly interested to hear her take on tracing the myth that the Chinese discovered Australia. Before we do so, I just acknowledge that we are meeting today, or I'm based on the unceded lands of Nam, the home of the Kulin Nations, Wurundjeri, Wurrung and Bunurong people. And I'm assuming that many of you are on different lands, and I acknowledge elders past and present from those lands as well. And we give thanks for all the support that they give us in the research and work that we do. So thank you very much, Sophie. It's such a thrill that you're going to be talking to us. I think all of us find this so tantalising. So over to you. I'll block my screen and then come back at the end. Introduce Dr. Lily.
I'll share my screen.
Thanks.
There we go. Thank you so much, Lynette, and also in advance to Lily, the discussant, and hello from Bunurong country. So this research really started with a sense of irritation from me, a personal irritation, at some of the baseless and really quite weak claims that are made about the pre-European kind of discovery of Australia by Chinese people that are perpetuated in the mainstream media. And so I want to give you, just to start off, 4 kind of little case studies to show what I mean by that. So in 2015, I visited Darwin and the delightful community Chinese museum there. And this is a photograph of the display of a Xiaolo figurine. Xiaolo is a Taoist god of immortality, and he was uncovered in 1879 in Darwin. And there are basically 3 theories as to how he came to be found. But as you'll see, there's a very big prominence played to one of them, which is the idea that he was brought by Zheng He, by one of the people on the Zheng He Ming Dynasty ships. And this is reinforced by a copy of 1421 by Gavin Menzies. Now, I need to say this is an old display. It's been recycled from an exhibition called Sweet and Sour that was developed back in the 1990s. And you know, I'm not going to be too hard on a small museum. They're under-resourced. Keeping displays up to date is difficult. But I think it serves to show the 2 other theories for where this figure was found are tucked in 2 paragraphs at the end of the second panel. And those 2 theories are that fishes from trepang fishes from Macassar brought it with them, and the other alternative that it was early Chinese settlers to Darwin and the Northern Territory who might have brought it. But it's not just small museums that do this. So here we have an FAQ page on the National Library of Australia's website. And again, a big placement for Menzies' book 1421. It's right up front. Now, to be fair to the National Library, they acknowledge that there are people who disagree with Menzies, and they provide a lot of links to evidence that supports that disagreement and that controversy. But in my mind, they give Menzies' work a credence that it doesn't deserve. Now, the third kinds of claims that we find are discoveries of ancient Chinese artifacts, such as this rather lovely baby Buddha that's reported to be from the Ming era. Now, one of the things these claims, even though they have that very precious question mark at the end of their titles, what they don't really properly acknowledge, I think, is the fact that a Chinese object does not necessarily belong to a Chinese person. and that we can't be sure, even if this baby Buddha could be authentically dated to the Ming era, we can't be certain that it was placed in Australia during the Ming. And I think it's really important to remember that Chinese have been present in Australia since the 1820s. And we know throughout the 19th century and into the 20th century that they were adventurous in where they went to Australia, looking for economic opportunities and places to live. We also know that the West have been collecting Chinese fine arts for centuries, as have the people from Southeast Asia. And I think we also need to keep an open mind that First Nations people might also be circulating this kind of material culture. Now, the final case study I want to provide is Benjamin Law's recent documentary, in which he traces his family history and the Chinese history of Australia in a two-part documentary. Now, in the second episode, he's sitting with a Yolngu elder in Northern Australia, talking about the Macassar-Trepang trade and Chinese links to that trade. And he notices that this elder is using sticks like chopsticks, and they make a comment about it. And he draws from the elder the claim that there was direct contact between First Nations people and Chinese prior to the Macassan trade in Trepang. And this then spurred this article with this heading claiming that Chinese Australian history predates the First Fleet. Now, Benjamin Law's he's well-intentioned in this claim, but and I don't claim to be an expert in Aboriginal history or Aboriginal culture to any depth, but I know as a scholar of Australian history that Aboriginal ways of thinking about the past, about history, and the relationship between history and myth and storytelling is very complicated. And I certainly wouldn't be grabbing onto a comment made in an interview in front of television cameras as such evidence. And I think it's when you look at the work of Ian McIntosh, who has done just a truly beautiful job of untangling the complexity of that story in West Arnhem Land. And he demonstrates the deep knowledge that you need in order to untangle that story. So I've got a picture here just of Southeast Asia. It's to kind of refresh your memory of where Australia sits in relation to these places and this space. And what I want to do in this paper is trace claims and evidence that are used to support this idea that Chinese discovered Australia, and trace them back in time to better understand why this claim is so appealing and so enduring. As we'll see, this kind of revisionist history has been going on for a long time. It surprised me, in fact, how long. And the nature of the evidence to support these claims is also eerily reverberates through time. There's creative readings of historical maps that require expertise to read. The maps are often poorly provenanced, and they come from translations. They're copies of copies. They're often in other languages, so they're difficult to read. Poorly provenanced found objects that really it's difficult to make sense of without a proper archaeological context. The use of verbatim, uncontextualised accounts from First Nations people, often reported by other people. But I want to just pause now and acknowledge that I'm diving into an incredibly complex space. And some of the things I touch on are that I have some discomfort about how much knowledge I have, but I'm barging on anyway. To fully understand, some of what I've been talking about, you really need to be a historic cartographer, have expertise in linguistics and languages, anthropology, ethnography, different forms of archaeology, different forms of history. But I'm trying to stick in my space as a historian, look at the nature and context of these claims rather than assessing their veracity. Although I do want to say that personally, as an educated person looking at most of the claims, I think that they're speculative more than concrete. And I don't think having lots of speculative pieces of evidence necessarily adds up to something, adds up to a solid claim. My methodology has been, I've been a bit like a bowerbird, picking through the public record, looking for shiny blue fragments across time, across disciplines, and from professional through to amateur and public writings. I'm at the start of this journey, I think. So I'm very keen to hear your feedback and your thoughts to help shape how I move forward. Now, I want to start by confessing that my paper title is deliberately polemic, and particularly in the use of the words myth and discovered. I need to stay upfront, there are incredibly solid kind of reasons why we might believe that Chinese people knew about and perhaps had contact with Australia and First Nations people prior to Europeans. Here's a map just showing Southeast Asian maritime routes, through the area. We know that Chinese were writing about the nature of Southeast Asian shipping vessels from the 1st century. These vessels were better than the Chinese vessels that were being used. Victor Purcell puts Chinese contact with Indonesia as early as the 3rd or 4th century. Fa Xian, who was a Chinese Buddhist monk, journeyed into Southeast Asia. Yi Jing, also a Chinese Buddhist monk, ventured into Southeast Asia in the 7th century, and their journeys are recorded in the official history of the Tang that was compiled in the 10th century. It's not really until the 12th century that we start to get kind of sustained engagement between China and Southeast Asia. And this is reflected in some of the shipwrecks that have been found in the area. And you can see that Chinese junks are being found wrecked from about the 12th century onwards. We also see from this fascinating list compiled by Anthony Reid, the junks that were licensed in Fujian in the late 16th century. And there's an incredibly wide range of places that these junks are going to. But I suppose one of the points that I want to make is that going to a place, you can't always assume that engagement is sustained, that it is all-encompassing either, that just because they go to one bit of a landmass that they've automatically covered that whole landmass. Now, this map is this is a terrible map to put up as a historian. It's out of time. This is a map of concentrations of Chinese settlement in Southeast Asia in 1944, so quite recent. But what I really like about this map is that it shows how scattered it is. And it shows that concentrations of Chinese settlement are often associated with trading ports and with trading entrepôts. Now, one of the things that's been argued is that it was outside traders who ventured to China first, and that it was Chinese traders who then followed in the paths of Arabs, Hindus, and Persian traders, and probably also Southeast Asian ones. And that they then tended to establish themselves at these trading entrepôts once they had been already established, and that they would then trade with local communities who, like the story we know about the Macassans, then go out and get the resources that they need to travel back to China. So the other thing that I think I've learnt from my readings in the Southeast Asian history space is also how very local it is and how important the local is in this story. In order to understand the flows of trade and of people. You need to know about the local conditions in the places of departure in China and also the destinations. Who's in control? What are the laws? Can ships travel? What are the taxes on things? How amenable are things for trade? Just because you can go to a place doesn't necessarily mean that you will. And so the myth component, I think, of the pre-European discovery of Australia by Chinese really emerges from the truly how tantalizingly close we know Chinese traders and travellers and sailors were in the region for so long. We know that Chinese were capable of discovering Australia for a long time, for centuries. And so the myth is really more that we have the evidence to prove that connection, and that this evidence and this claim somehow rewrites existing history. And so this leads to my second contentious word in my title, discovered. And I've thought a lot about what does discovery mean? So, is discovery a Chinese trader or a traveller on a Southeast Asian crewed ship arriving in Australia? What if that Southeast Asian has Chinese ancestry? How much Chinese ancestry makes them Chinese? We know that Chinese were settled and mixing with Southeast Asian communities for centuries. So, there's families being formed. Does discovery need to be state sanctioned? Does the emperor have to send the ships in order for it to count as a discovery? Must there be written evidence of this discovery? We know that the very early shipping around this area was learnt through experience. It was transferred verbally. This knowledge of Australia and how to get to Australia won't necessarily be found written in descriptions or on maps. And well, what does that mean? It doesn't mean that people don't know about it. And how much contact is significant. Just putting a plate on an island, planting a flag in the sand, making one trade, 2 trades, 10 trades. What's significant? What's important? Now, I've put discovered in inverted commas. Of course, this is because First Nations people have been present in Australia for tens of thousands of years. They knew their country very, very well. And this leads to this idea that discovery is really more about the person doing the discovering, more about the story of discovery than it is sort of about, sorry, it's more about the telling of the discovery than it is about the discovery event itself. Now, Graham Davison, in his Use and Abuse of Australian History, describes the heroic journey or the Great Voyage as one of the mythic themes used by New World nations to tell their histories. These are stories of adventure and of risk, and they have resonance and power because they're echoed by all the colonists and settlers and convicts who undertake that journey, who follow. The concept of discovery, I think, is embedded in these histories, and certainly is in the 19th century as a common heading in histories. Discovery histories, of course, are ways for colonisers to justify their colonisation. They emphasise the idea that the place is unknown, that it can be discovered. The idea that Chinese people might have discovered Australia before the British, I think the more I look at it, feels more a part of telling the British discovery story, a little interesting sideline. It doesn't actually fundamentally challenge the assumption that Australia was unknown, that Australia was there to be discovered. Now, on to a few case studies. Ironically, the idea that Chinese might have discovered Australia prior to the British occurred to Matthew Flinders as he's skirting the northern coast of Australia in December 1802. Now, of course, the mystery of this foreign contact and these Chinese-style hats is soon solved when he encounters Pobaso and his 6 trepang prows 2 months later. Now, this kind of confusion between the Macassan and Bougainese trepangers and Chinese contact with Australia is a theme that kind of weaves throughout this story. And of course, there's also accounts from the Dutch. There are some Dutch accounts of that they knew that individual Chinese traders and seamen may have reached or did reach Australia in the mid-18th century. Whether they're calling that discovery is another matter. Now, the first historical account that we have, and there might be earlier ones, is George Butler Earp's account in The Gold Colonies of Australia. It was published in 1852. This was written as a guide for prospective immigrants and published right at the dawn of the gold rushes, and was incredibly popular. According to the publisher, sold tens of thousands of copies. Whether that's true or not is another matter. Earp's claims are based on an error in translation of an account of Marco Polo's travels, the discovery of some Chinese oars and nautical implements at a considerable depth, somewhere that he doesn't name, and a tradition to this effect amongst First Nations people. Now, he claims that these people said that they had murdered these Chinese visitors. This is perhaps referring to, again, he doesn't name where this account comes from. Now, only a few years later, 1859, Richard Henry Major goes back to the translations of Marco Polo's travels, points out the error, and in 1861, he directly disputes Earp's claims. Samuel Sidney in 1852 and George Collingridge in 1895 are also sceptical of the Marco Polo claim, but do mention that there was a high likelihood that Chinese had discovered Australia before Europeans. Now, by the time we get to the latter part of the 19th century, the idea that some people believed that Australia had been discovered by the Chinese had become a real part of the kind of public vernacular, to such a degree that these 3 articles are actually satirical pieces. They're not factual. And they 2 are published in 1888 and 1 in 1896. And this is a period of really particularly virulent anti-Chinese rhetoric, particularly in newspapers. And these satirical articles are used to attack and ridicule present Chinese living in Australia at that time, or to attack others on that basis. The Bulletin and the Nepean Times article are both based on another contemporary claim that I haven't been able to locate. But this claim seems to be based on the idea that one of Kublai Khan's fleets during the Mongol run of the Yuan dynasty in the 13th century discovered Australia. Now, we know that Kublai Khan unsuccessfully sought to subjugate Java in 1292, but there's no evidence that he and his armada full of soldiers came to Australia. Now, it's not until the second half of the 20th century that we find the first claims linking the voyages of Zheng He and the other eunuch commanders between 1405 and 1433 to Australia's discovery. And this is a map, a schematic showing roughly those journeys. Now, there might be earlier examples. Jeff Wade has pointed out that some of the earliest writing in English about these journeys occurred as early as 1874. But the claim linking Zheng He's voyages with Australia's discovery, the first example I found, is in 1932. And it's made by William Goddard, who's a translator and president and founder of the Queensland branch of the China Society of Australia. And he later became a popular radio presenter. he suggested that Chinese discovered Australia based on the following. He argued that ships from Zheng He's fleet broke away and sailed southwards when they reached the Indian Ocean. He claims that there was a map in Beijing dated 1426 that represented the Great Southland. Also supporting this was a ship's sign found in WA years ago, and also a box of Ming coins and Ming porcelain fragments that was found deeply buried near Storm Bay in Tasmania. He also observed that there were quite a few Aboriginal place names on the northern coast of New South Wales that sounded Chinese, and one was Nimbin, and kind of looking into the origins of that name, it seems a rather dubious claim. When Frank Goldsmith wrote about the discovery of WA in 1946, he largely repeated Goddard's claims. But now, for some reason, the Chinese map is a porcelain map, which I noticed porcelain maps were made in Japan, and was presented to the Emperor Yingzong and proved that Zheng He had circumnavigated Australia. Now, Goldsmith's book received a little bit of publicity. There's some articles in the Courier Mail and the Argus, although the Argus does warn that his claims move into the realm of conjecture. In 1932, Norman Tyndale, curator of the South Australian Museum, linked the discovery of the figure of Xiaolao, the goddess, the Taoist god of immortality that I spoke about earlier, with the discovery of Australia, and he linked it to the Tang dynasty. And he seems to have largely done this because this was a period when Chinese junks travelled to Sumatra and Java. Now, Tyndale had picked up this find from an early reference about its discovery by Thomas Warsnop in 1897. Now, in Warsnop's account, he doesn't actually identify it as Chinese. He thinks actually that it might be Indian. But what Warsnop does do is provide a fairly detailed provenance for this beautiful artefact, which is not made of black jade as Tyndale thought. And Warsnop recounts that it was found in 1879 when the Department of Public Works was clearing dense scrub for a road. William Strawbridge, who took it into his possession, and his team of Chinese labourers removed a banyan tree, and in the roots, about 4 feet down, apparently, they found the figurine. Now, when this is talked about, this figure now, it's placed at Doctor's Gully. But actually the original source places it 60 chains west from the east end of Mitchell Street, in the centre line of the road, and this has later been identified as Doctor's Gully. And when I did the kind of calculations, that's how it worked. But these distinctions sometimes are important. It was black with dirt and was considered to have been buried for a long period. Now, these accounts appeared in within an Aboriginal culture and language context, and it was about Aboriginal contact with foreigners, basically. So not much was made about these claims until Charles Price Fitzgerald, C.P. Fitzgerald, the notable historian and sinologist, spoke about it at an ANU summer school event in 1953. His talk was reported in newspapers, not all supportive, and he subsequently published an account of it in a literary anthology. Now, he certainly doesn't make claims that he certainly suggested. He's certainly saying that this is a suggestion, that there's a big question mark over this hypothesis, and he never actually publishes this in anything resembling a scholarly space. But he links the figurine to Zheng He's Ming fleets, and he argues that he believes that one of those ships split off and went as far as Timor, because he argues that this is the first time that Timor is mentioned in Chinese records. And so he says, oh, it's just a small jump then from Timor to Australia. He believes that the figure is jade. Actually, it's thought to be a much softer stone, more like a soapstone. And so on this basis, he believes that it must have belonged to a commander on one of the fleets, because it was a high value item. So just to kind of set the record straight on this figure, which is held by the Museum of Applied Arts and Sciences, they actually regard it as probably being made in the 19th century. And that it was probably deposited a few years before it was found. And they have, in fact, a really detailed and excellent outline of the provenance and history of this object. Now, from this period on, the mid-1950s, we start to see a much greater separation between the scholarly and mainstream narratives about the discovery of Australia by Chinese. That scholarly research is scholarly research at this time in history, in anthropology is professionalizing. It's becoming more sophisticated. It's more careful, and yes, it still continues to explore the role of Chinese traders and trading within the Southeast Asian region and Australia. Mainstream narratives, however, explosively go in another way. So Gavin Menzies, with the help of a ghostwriter, a PR agency, and a very willing publisher, released 1421 in 2002. It was met with huge public interest, lots of promotion across radio and all sorts of spaces, and equally passionate scholarly criticism. In 2005, it was the second largest history title being sold in Australia. Now, this book revives a long-held idea. Just note that this map is upside down, so south is at the top, that the French Dieppe school maps that show Java-le-Grand, that Java-le-Grand is actually represents Australia. And there's quite convincing dispute of this claim. And he also takes it a step further, arguing that it was Chinese knowledge that somehow formed the creation of these maps. He claims that there were not just one Chinese journey to Australia, but in fact there were multiple journeys made by the Ming fleets. One of these, he claims, floundered in Warrnambool, where it became the mythical mahogany ship. Menzies supports his speculative map claims with even more speculative supporting evidence. I think you can tell I'm not a fan. As well as the mahogany ship, we also have the claim that the survivors of this ship, which according to Professor Wei Zhu Tsen, actually rode by horseback from Victoria up to Cooktown to meet the other ships. He talks about a lost 1447 porcelain map, which he believed is in the Taiwan University. He brings in the Batangabi ruins near Eden. Or the Gympie pyramids and Gympie ape get a showing, and if you haven't heard of them, you might enjoy Googling it. And also very literal, uncontextual, secondhand accounts from First Nations people, as well as, of course, found objects and the Doctor's Gully Shaolao. Now, much of this evidence is, frankly, preposterous. I was kind of appalled at how bad the book really was. Four Corners ran an expose called Junk History about how the book was cleverly marketed as a revisionist history, but had no scholarly rigor behind its publication or editorial process. But there is a persistence to Menzies' account. When I went to my local library to look at a copy, the librarian was really keen to share with me how exciting he found the ideas in it. So what is it that makes this so intriguing? I think the revisionist history aspect of it sits really at the heart of it, and this idea that this story is a bit quirky and a bit interesting. But I think that there's two ways in which it's a revisionist history, and there's a more modern version that I think is emerging. So the first is simply as a counter to the idea that the British discovered Australia. The second is a kind of ironic counter narrative to the racism and discrimination that Chinese have faced since British colonisation. So fears about Chinese immigration, fears about Chinese arrival from the gold rushes through the White Australia policy period, you know, the whole yellow peril thing, Pauline Hanson's criticisms of Chinese immigration. And so there's an irony that Chinese might have, in fact, beaten the British to Australia. But again, there's something a bit more to this. And I think Law's documentary and also perhaps the Darwin Chinese Museum display speak to this. And this is about a search for connection. And this, I think, is particularly apparent in Chinese Australians or Chinese immigrants, where they're looking for a connection between China, their cultural or actual birth homeland, and Australia, their new home that both embraces and rejects them as residents. Now, Beijing-born artist Guan Wei developed an exhibition, Other Histories, for the Powerhouse Museum, and I think this is an interesting example of this. He was fascinated and inspired by the ideas in Menzies' book, and particularly the buried Taoist Shaolao figurine. And in response, he created an imaginary history that played with the tropes of museum displays and perhaps of truth, and retold a sort of fictitious history of Zheng He's discovery of Australia. In some ways, I find his reflection is arguably more honest than Menzies, because he at least places it in an imaginary space. But I do sense that Guan Wei wants this imaginary history to be true. So this leads me to now the final aspect of the endurance of this story, and that's its appeal to the Chinese Communist Party. In 2003, so a year after 1421's publication, President Hu Jintao stood in a joint sitting of Australian Parliament and said that Zheng He had reached Australia before the British. Now, this is also arguably another example of seeking a connection between Australia and China. But Menzies' theories complement the way the Chinese Communist Party have and continue to use the story of Zheng He's travels for political ends. And this has been argued by people like Jeff Wade and others. And this goes right back. So Deng Xiaoping used Zheng He, kind of pulled him out of the historical nowhere land in 1979 as part of his open door policy. He wanted to demonstrate that China could be outward looking. More recently, Hu Jintao and now Xi Jinping use him as an example of China as a benevolent world power. Zheng He is a diplomat. He's bringing trade and peaceful relations to the world. And the Belt and Road Project, which is a key policy of foreign policy of Xi Jinping's, explicitly draws on Zheng He's journeys, as well as the historic Silk Road trade route. Literally millions of dollars are being poured into archaeology and scholarship into researching Zheng He's journeys and those Ming voyages. Now, the research of Jeff Wade and others demonstrates that there's another story to the one that is perhaps coming out of China. And that is that these voyages, Zheng He's voyages, were military missions that were intended to awe foreign powers, to create legitimacy for a usurping emperor who'd just come into power, that it was about bringing foreign polities into submission and collecting treasure for the imperial court. The ships carried thousands of military men, they carried weapons, and there were military actions, including violence on these journeys. And this included installing a puppet leader in Sri Lanka because the previous leaders weren't going to show submission. So I think there's some cautions here to take care about how we might imagine Chinese contact and colonisation in Australia might have been. Guan Wei's imagined Chinese connection was decidedly peaceful and friendly, but one has to wonder how the First Nations people of Taiwan, of Tibet, of Xinjiang might imagine that same scenario. So in closing, kind of these weak claims about the pre-European discovery of Australia by Chinese people that have so irritated me and will continue to irritate me are absolutely no doubt going to continue. My paper is going to make not one scrap of difference. Some will claim outright that Chinese discovered Australia, like Menzies, and others will raise it as a tantalising question. This has been the established pattern for 2 centuries. It's a tiny bit tiresome, and I wonder whether, if we're going to stick with this discovery theme, whether it might be a more interesting question to ask why Chinese did not discover Australia. But I'm hopeful that the media and the general public will at some point catch up with scholarly research, and that they won't feel the need for Australia to be discovered by a world power or to be discovered at all, that they might become interested, as I have, in the significance of the much smaller histories or local histories of engagement and interconnection between various ethnic groups, both in Southeast Asia and also in Australia. Because for me, I think there's many more meaningful histories in this space. These local histories require real specificity, attention to ethnic and cultural difference, and I think that ultimately they will help us to better understand the larger flows of people, goods and ideas. Thank you.
Thank you, Sophie. Thank you so much. Now, I don't know. Oh, there we go. I'm on. Thank you very much. Now, Lily, Dr. Lily Yulianti from our team is going to offer a few minutes of reflection, and then we'll open it up to questions. We've already got a couple of comments in the talk, so we might be able to talk about those. Lily.
Yes, thank you, Lynette, and hi everyone. I'm speaking from the Wurundjeri country, the Institute of Norms. Thank you very much, Sophie. This is such a great presentation and also a reunion for Sophie and I, because we worked together for a project back in 2018, 2019 for the trading cultures. Yeah, there's several things that I would like to highlight here. I'm really interested to look at how we should localize the history, Sophie, because during my recent visit to Makassar, all my informants actually talk about Chinese were not interested to go to Australia. So we've got these interesting stories that, where the third generation of the last Tripengers family that I interviewed, and also our in-country researchers interviewed last year, set up the trade network as Chinese merchants went to Makassar, waiting for the tripang there, and they never thought that they need to go to Australia. Because here I would like to quote Pin Sun Chang, that with a really good observation that Chinese merchants were already trading in all corners of maritime Southeast Asia. This they have capacity, they're very capable. And the highlight was that business opportunity is always become the main thing for the Chinese merchants. So the way they calculate this, the trades, and then how should I brought all these goods, foods and other stuff from China, and then establish the trade in the port of Makassar while waiting for the tripang brought by the Makassar tripangers at the same port, and they already have this a really good calculation about how to run the business. So I think I agree with you. I think that the question was not did Chinese discover Australia, but why did Chinese didn't want to go to Australia? Because they already set up this business model and it lasted for three centuries. The other thing about the scholarly research and also the mainstream media's narratives really interesting to look at the Benjamin Low waltzing with the dragon, for example. But if you look at how the press, especially in the US and also Europe, gave a really big publicities for Menzies, a book back in 2002. And there was actually an event where Menzies actually gave a talk at London's Royal Geographical Society. And this event was picked up by one of the Chinese satellite televisions called Phoenix Stations. And there were 3 million Chinese people watch that event live. And from here, we see that everything about China is always interesting, not only for Chinese people or people living in China, but for everyone in the world. Like the idea about Chinese who runs the world and everything is always interesting and tantalizing. And also there's another thing about the imagination about why did the Chinese merchant didn't go to Australia in the context of a tripang network. I would like to share my my interview with Chinese artist Xiao Xiaoping, because just like the other Chinese artists, he also obsessed with this question and put all these imaginations that through a really nice symbol of string, like who actually controlled this string that connected southern China, Makassar, and Australia. And then one of the artwork actually saw an indigenous woman who controlled the string. It's such a really good interpretation. I mean, like of course it's a imaginations, obsessions about why did the Chinese, and then through this artwork, I understand that even you have an obsession as a Chinese to answer the question, why did my ancestor didn't come to Australia? But at least you try to be honest that, well, there's a network that already established in a global context in the port of Makassar, and that's all what Chinese merchants needed at the time. So that kind of things that we take this history, the connections, the early encounters between China and people from Nusantara, especially the Buginese and Makassaris, with the indigenous Australians, is always like a peaceful imaginations for the locals in Makassar. So it's quite clear that we as Makassar always believe that all you needed for this trade network is to establish a really good system, business system based in Makassar. And that's how actually we understand the history. And from the reconstruction project, the replica project, Nur Al Marege back in 2019, a crew of the local crew for this project actually tried to reconstruct all the utensils, tools, foreign objects that possibly brought by the Makassar tripangers. What's actually objects that you might find in in the prau. And of course, it reflects how global actually the world was at that time. You have a clay pots, of course, it's from South Sulawesi, from Bugis and Makassar's local artists. But you also learned that the Makassar Tripangers already use iron pots, which is from China. Cooking utensils and liquors from the Dutch, of course. So as we have discussed this a few days ago, saying that the presence of the foreign objects is not necessarily parallel with the presence of the people from that place, because the connection that happened for centuries is already so global. Even the prau represent the idea of global networks back then. And I think for the last point that I would like to discuss or comment in here is about Cheng He or Cheng Ho. Indonesian people love Cheng Ho so much because the idea is not about whether it's a myth or is it true or not, whether they are against or pro. Menzies thinking about the the expeditions, but as you said that each history needs to be understood as a local history, because we need to understand the place, the culture, the social context of the history. And so for the Indonesians, Cheng Ho is a hero for people in Indonesia. Why? Because there's a Muslim or Islam identity attached to this hero. So the idea that, you know what, Chinese people come to the archipelago, and it was the first Muslim missions from China. So there are at least 3 Cheng Ho's mosque in Indonesia. One is East Java, one in Palembang, and I think one in Central Java. So the narrative about discovery or how do you say, control or colonial, how to control a certain region. Actually, I couldn't find this during my interview from my recent visit, but people accept, people embrace, and people curate what they need from the foreigners that arrive in their place. So the local agency is very important in this case, of course. So I leave it there because I believe there's so many comments and questions for you, Sophie. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Lily. Actually, there's a lot of comments here, and I'll go in reverse order. And Campbell has made the observation, Campbell McKnight, that, and I completely agree that really Menzies is a crook, and you're linking it to Chinese chauvinism is correct. Lots of comments about how terrific your talk is, Sophie. So what we will do is we'll save the chat and send it to you later.
Thank you.
But there was a couple of other comments. Ebony Hughes made a comment about discovery and being a really good direction to go in, particularly about community adding knowledge to a place, a thing in their existing knowledge. So multiple nations can discover Australia each time adding something to their knowledge. But James Hatch had a comment which is very, I think, builds on that, or actually preempted it. And that there's the word perhaps we should use is rediscover, as First Nations people had already discovered Australia. All other discoveries are mere footnotes. And Bernard Zimmerman asked a question about Chinese fishermen, but I think you've covered that really well. But Neville Jones from the Northern Territory Chinese Museum notes that at least sort of, it looks like he has to do it every single day. And that's debunk the myth, the Shaolao myth, and also debunk, of course, the Menzies book. And I thought a lovely comment here, because this is exactly how I see it too. He kind of compares it to von Daniken's books of his and my youth, where everything came from aliens and out of space and, chariots of the gods and all of that. So it's very interesting. A couple of other comments have come through. Leonie's made a comment about how interesting it would be to see First Nations accounts of encounters with Chinese. And I think McIntosh is really at the forefront of that. That's a really fantastic piece of work that he did. Paul McGregor's noted that after Ben Law's episode aired, he questioned him about the veracity of the Chinese coin, which he explained had previously been debunked. But that line was deleted from the streaming version of the thing, needless to say. And sadly, the Melbourne Chinese Museum included the Zheng He discovery myth in the video they produced for its 1 million story exhibition, which is very disappointing, of course. And I think this might be our last one. Irene Jacobs has said, thank you for your interesting research and presentation. And she'd like to give a small comment on the fact that a few times you said that it was the British who first Europeans discovered Australia, but not the British. Of course, it was the Dutch. They did so in 1644. Well, in fact, we would go 1606 when we've been, that's what our whole project is dedicated to. So thank you for pointing that out, Irene. We're right on time. Does anybody have a question for Sophie? I mean, this has been a really terrific, wonderful romp, actually. Really enjoyed it a great deal.
Thank you, Lynette.
Really did. And I'm reminded, I noticed Kate Bagnall was on before. She may not still be here, but I'm reminded of one shouldn't really quote Twitter, but a tweet that Kate put out last week or a couple of weeks ago, where she was talking about how she almost sort of regularly has to correct people when they say that the first piece of legislation that the Australian Federal Parliament passed was the White Australia policy. And she points out that it was, in fact, the 17th piece of legislation that they passed. I think it's really interesting because there is that kind of perception and connection between the White Australia policy and, of course, the yellow peril and all of the rest. So that strikes me as a very interesting, that the myth is now even being inscribed into, the kind of popular view that somehow our first legislation was White Australia policy, clearly when it wasn't.
Yeah, and I think in the end you can never win debunking these myths. All you can do is understand why people want to hold them.
Yes, absolutely. But I was unaware that they actually had transported the junk became the mahogany ship, the mahogany ship.
Yes. Yeah. I couldn't go into the details of some of these claims, but there's the mahogany ship is hilarious because I think the latest research is showing that they don't think it even existed.
No.
That the eyewitness accounts were happening way after they were supposed to have.
Absolutely. We had a couple of years back now doing some native title work down in that kind of Warrnambool area. And some of the young Aboriginal kids were telling us, well, they weren't young Aboriginal kids then, they were grown-up men and women, but they were telling us that when they originally started doing some augering to locate the so-called mahogany ship, they would throw old bolts and things down the hole. The next day they'd be saying, oh, we found metal. And these kids knew damn well that they'd actually just deposited them there the night before. Yeah. So it's rather funny. Yeah. So look, I'm just going to click on the last slide. Oh, and that's not what's happened. Sorry. David, could you click on the last slide for me, please? For our next symposium, I've got symposium on the brain. For our next seminar, which is next month, here it is, on the 21st of July, we have Mike Rowland, who is working with us. He's going to be presenting on encountering the east coast of Australia and Leonie Stevens will be our discussant. Later in the year, we've got Annie Clark speaking, and she'll be talking about some of her work up on Groote Eylandt. And then very excited to announce that on the 19th and 20th of October, we are finally heading off to Indonesia and we'll be giving our symposium in Jakarta. So I think that's probably it for the night. I have now saved the chat, so I will email that to you, Sophie.
Thank you.
Sincere thanks for a really interesting and entertaining, wonderful talk. Really enjoyed it a great deal. Look forward to seeing the written version of it.
Thank you, Lynette. And I'm happy if people want to email me afterwards and continue chatting.
Thank you so much.
Okay, thank you.
Good night,
Bye.
everybody. Bye-bye.